Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a Caixaforum Madrid.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Madrid to this topic. First of all, I would like to welcome the Princess Infanta Cristina, the director of Fundación La Caixa for social events, and then Caminos Baum will take the floor, the executive coordinator of the Humanitarian Action and Conflict Institute. Yours is the floor, Princess Cristina. You. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank your presence here at this panel, Climate Change, a Threat for Nutrition and Food Security, organized together with the High Commissioner for Refugees for United Nations and UNHCR. I would like to welcome as well the presence of the speakers that will be with us, as well as those who are connected. As many of you know, Fundación La Caixa, from the beginning, when it started about 120 years ago, is characterized for the important social commitment in order to improve the quality of life of people, promoting social activities, educational, cultural, and scientific activities. The mission of the foundation is to build or contribute to build a better and fair society, giving opportunity to those who are most in need, with the values of excellence and commitment. Most of its activity focuses on Portugal and Spain. However, since more than 20 years ago, we organized international cooperation programs in order to improve the social conditions of those populations that are most vulnerable in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Our strategy in those countries is to provide opportunities and to combat inequalities through programs that will contribute to the fulfillment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations. Our 4 areas of action are creation of employment through Work for Progress, whose goal is promoting employment of young people and women who are vulnerable through social innovation platforms. Global health, focusing on fighting the major causes of child mortality, malaria and pneumonia, improving the organization management and the management of civil society organizations and humanitarian society organizations who focus on people who are affected by humanitarian crisis. In order to increase the impact of our interventions, we work together with the major actors of international cooperation. And this is the case of our alliance with ACNUR, we collaborate for more than 20 years ago, based on common values. We've been working in 14 projects in 10 in order to help meet the most important needs in refugee camps in Africa and Asia. In 2017, we decided to create an alliance for malnutrition or undernutrition in early ages. This is the MAL project, whose means mother project. The major project, or the major goal of this MUM project, is to improve the nutritional conditions of under 5 years old, as well as lactating women in Ethiopia, who is a country where more than 800,000 refugees live. The mothers are the focus of this, and they will need to become the focus of our actions in order to make sure that the babies actually survive and can develop in fully and equal opportunities. With Fundación La Caixa contributes with 7 million euros to the MUM project, and thanks to that, 1.5 refugees and displaced people have been benefiting from this project, mainly mothers, pregnant women, and lactating, breastfeeding women and children. This nutrition project in the refugee camps has undergone a very important change from the point of view of the productive and the management point. This alliance, this partnership means that the UNHCR has actually made a huge commitment, and their work has been fundamental in order to achieve their goals. And this is why I would like to thank them all for their great job. We still have many things to do and many challenges ahead of us. In the last few years, humanitarian crises linked to armed conflicts, as well as those linked to disasters, natural disasters, have changed a lot in numbers and the way in which they manifest themselves and the impact they have. Humanitarian needs are still growing on a yearly basis as a consequence of chronic armed conflicts, the exposure to natural disasters, the natural deterioration, and the impact of climate change, which has exacerbated food security for thousands and hundreds of thousands of people in the world and millions of people in the world. The number of refugees and displaced people has reached huge peaks, huge levels. We will be listening to the panelists about this in this panel. We will be faithful to our commitment. We will carry on promoting humanitarian projects and promoting humanitarian alliances and partnerships under the major principles and with the support of the principles of Fundación La Caixa. Thank you. Hello, welcome you all to this panel. We are going to be fortunate enough to reflect upon the topics exposed in this short video clip and the words delivered by Princess Christina. Climate change is a very important thing. It's one of the major challenges that we have ahead of us for humankind. And it sounds sometimes as an abstract thing. In terms of humanitarian action in all countries in the world, we see increasingly that this is something very specific, because we can actually feel the very specific and direct consequences, the impact of the effects of climate change. And this is the topic that we're going to be dealing with in this panel. And more specifically, we're going to focus on climate change and how it threats to food security and nutrition. For this, we will be able to focus on the MOM project, which is a collaboration, a cooperation between Fundación La Caixa and UNHCR. For this, we are lucky enough to have two colleagues of ours as well as another colleague who will be with us through the internet, through streaming. I would like to introduce then, first of all, to Andrew Harper. He is a special advisor for climate change at UNHCR, whose headquarters is in Geneva. And from them, he runs or he manages global actions in terms of strategy, supervision, contributing to expertise to climate change and the impact, how to take this into account for humanitarian action. Andrew has a huge experience. Among other things, he ran the innovation service for UNHCR, and this gave him the opportunity to participate in very important projects with the use of new technologies, biometric technologies, new systems, in order to work with cash transfers and other elements for refugee populations in Jordan, for instance, where there were huge refugee camps as a consequence of the Syrian war, who still exist today. He has had other positions, of the important positions. He's worked in other contexts, and we are very fortunate to have him with us today as a special advisor for climate action in ACNUR. We will be able to ask him about what strategies and experiences they tackle this huge work in associations such as UNHCR. Then we have Fernando Valladares, who's here with us too. Fernando is PhD in biology. He works at the SIC, who is the National Organization for Scientific Research. He is professor at Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid. He is very well prestigious because of the different works that he's published. And he is expert in analyzing biodiversity and climate change and human actions, human activities. And he especially is a major agent for writing articles and giving talks and lectures that reach very many people beyond the academic world. He has had different awards, Jomi the First, the BBVA award, and many other awards. So Fernando is a huge expert who will be providing us a scientific and perspective linked to the disseminating information and raising awareness action through citizen initiatives or the promoting of citizen initiatives that can actually be focusing in the future. Then Anne Bush is our third colleague who is online. We will see her shortly. And on the screen, Anne has been an experience of 20 years as an advisor in the field of nutrition and public health in the world. She has worked with very many organizations, donors, NGOs, and our governments, United Nations agencies, and many other organizations. And she has helped in the development of policies in her area of expertise. And she has also worked in other activities linked to those projects that have taken place in different countries. Welcome, the three of us, the three of you, I mean. It's a pleasure to have you here. Some of us speak Spanish, some others don't. So I suppose that among the audience, there will be some people who will speak English and others won't. So there is simultaneous translations for those who don't understand English. So welcome all. And let's just hope that everything goes well. If you have any technical problem, please let us know. you can access this event in both languages. Please, we are going to try and actually be able to have a fruitful panel with the participation of all of you here at the venue where we are, as well as online. So there will be the opportunity to ask questions and also comments here. So we will try to elaborate on any question that you might have or comment you might want to make. And for that purpose, I would like to encourage you to access to the chat through which you can send your questions. We will do our best in order to answer them all and in order to share all comments around in the debate or the discussion session. So without any further ado, welcome you all, and let's just get started.
Muy bien.
Okay. Let's start with some questions then. Andrew's here with us. And the first question I would like to ask him is the following. Could you please provide us some context in terms of UNHCR as to how climate change provokes displacement of communities and how communities that are already displaced, displacement, what kind of impact has on people, on those communities that are displaced wherever they actually arrive?
Nuevamente vamos a intentar tener.
So, please, let's just be agile in the answers to have time for everyone to take part at the debate. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, and thank everyone for being here. I've got 5 minutes, so I'll stick to my time limit. But I think probably the most important thing in terms of working with climate or with refugees is to say that you cannot do it by yourself. The refugees have got agency, they're trying to do whatever they can to survive. The host communities are doing whatever they can to survive. The governments. But without you and without supporters like the Foundation, the leadership of Her Royal Highness, we wouldn't be able to achieve as much. And so when we're talking about UNHCR and our work with climate, probably what is key, what is most key is to understand what's happening on the ground, listening to the communities and finding out what are their needs and what are their aspirations and what are their hopes. So it always has to be addressed at the bottom. And then we have to work in a collaborative manner across the UN system, but importantly, people were talking about like coalitions of the willing. Willing is not enough. There's a lot of talk out there. We're going towards our 28th COP. There's been talking and commitments and non-delivery. What we need is a coalition of action. And so when we talk about refugees, when we see those photos up there, people don't want to see meetings. People do not want to see commitments. They want to see that translated on the ground. And so the project which has been supported, the funding which has been provided by the people of Spain, this contributes to action on the ground. And so I just wanted to get that out straight away, because sometimes we can get fixated on ourselves and forget the people who are in that film. The other element too, you said to be agile, so I'm not, I'm not looking at my notes. The other thing about action in terms of climate change is we have to look at the science, we have to look at the evidence, we have to look at where trends are going, but at the same time we need to have the action now. So you need to have that immediate response, but then you also need to take into account where the future vulnerabilities will be. And so this is where it goes into the issues of how nutrition and food security come into being. Because we can already anticipate, for instance, that with El Nino probably kicking in the latter part of 2023, that 2024 will probably be one of the warmest years on record, will probably be the warmest year on record. So we already need to move ahead of the plans because the plans are based on the past. What we need to do is anticipate the future. So I will now go quickly through my slides.
Great.
Hopefully this will work.
Yeah.
Can I see at the back, or I'm just going to have to keep going back? Okay, so rather than me talking with not so much credibility, I've got the Secretary General to say the right things as well. What we're doing at the moment is just not to the scale that's required. Just before Christmas, I was in Somalia, and there was 1 million people that had been displaced. We had another 100,000 people move towards Ethiopia. So the great projects that you're doing in Ethiopia, based on the past. What we already have to do is anticipate how many more hundreds of thousands of people will be coming across in the next 6 months, 12 months. And so reacting is no longer sufficient. Everyone says the UN is slow, but we're often held back by resources. If we've got the evidence, if we've got the people saying what's going to happen, and we know what's going to happen, then we need to invest. We need to invest in identifying water, credible crops. When I talk about credible crops, we need to have drought-resistant crops. We need to be ensuring that the host communities are taken into account. Because unless we protect the environment in which people live, and we're talking about host communities, then why would those host communities protect refugees? So protecting the environment has a direct dividend on the protection of people. So these are some examples, and the way in which UNHCR and other agencies have worked in the past is changing. We're investing much more in development activities linked with the larger banks, the World Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, but most importantly, we're investing in people. We're investing in people and their ability to sustain themselves. It's no use just providing emergency response after emergency response. Again, these populations are probably not going to go back anytime soon. There's one figure which, again, coming out of Somalia, they've lost 9 million head of livestock in the last 2 or 3 years. If you lose your livestock, and we're talking goats, cattle, camels, then you lose your asset, you lose access to food, and children lose access to sustenance. And they don't go back because they've got no means, they've got no assets, they've got no money. So this is where we have to start looking at how will communities survive in the future. Here is just some examples. This is insect farming. Who would have thought that UNHCR would be involved in insect farming? But we have to look at different ways of providing the necessary sustenance in ways which does not have such a big impact on the environment. So we're looking at, we talked about innovation, we're looking at innovative ideas. But we can only do that with partners who, again, listening to people who know what they're talking about and putting that into action in these areas which are particularly on the front lines of the climate emergency. We'll be moving on to COP27 after this, but I will stop. That's my 5 minutes. Yalla.
Thank you very much. Aprovechando unas ideas.
Yes, you've mentioned a few things, Andrew. You say that climate change exists, and we know that it exists because there are scientific evidence that proves that there is climate change is a reality, and also we know what the future can be. What do you think, Fernando, about the evidence of climate change? There are some people who might not actually agree. How is society accepting this information? What do you think? Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank UNHCR because of the support that they provide in order to help solve these problems through their actions. And I'd like to thank them also because of the support that they give to the organization of this panel. Before I answer your question, I'd like to launch a request. 160 years ago, humankind was asking the eradication of poliomyelitis. Now, scientists say, and please let's get rid of refusal of the actual reality, because people refuse or say that no, this doesn't exist because they don't like reality. There is a way of negationism, which is retardanism, which means not providing the necessary importance for acting to combat climate change. So my request, which is the request of many scientists, is just this please to do all which is possible to get rid of all negationists. Everyone should agree and no one should has doubts. And if they have doubts, please ask us. Why do you have doubts? Please ask us and we will explain you. And science is not as exact, and climate change is a very complex issue. No one has 100% of truth. There is no revealed truth in this area. But there is 95% of certainty that human beings are responsible for climate change and the suffering that this is causing. And obviously we have orbital cycles and other changes have actions, the sun, the x-axis of the earth that actually have long-term action. Volcanoes also have an impact, and also sun activity, solar activity have an impact on climate. But the best possible science cannot really reconstruct what is happening or what has happened with climate change in the last 100 years. The only thing that we can explain the huge change that we have undergone in climate is greenhouse effects. If we don't take into account this element into the equation, we cannot explain what has actually happened in terms of climate. We cannot negate climate change. Of course, we can improve our data, we can improve implications, or how we improve implications, because this is an abstract phenomenon. And this is why negationists actually are there. But because we have to accept that a third of Pakistan was actually flooded, and we have not money enough to tackle these disasters, because people in those countries don't know that this is going to happen. They don't have insurance companies that can actually insure Pakistani people vis-a-vis flooding. When we have huge disasters, heat waves, etc., we really have some ideas of what climate change can happen. But climate change is a concept. It's a concept. And this is happening because we are absorbing more radiation than we should. And this is why scientists understand that society cannot really understand fully what climate change is. And this happened also with COVID. It is very difficult for people to understand climate change as an abstract thing. So negationism can be understood, but it cannot be accepted. 120 years ago, greenhouse effects were documented in terms of the scientific impact. At Harvard University, it was shown how ExxonMobil knew exactly the impact of climate change that they were contributing to. 50 years ago, ExxonMobil actually had a project in order to study what happened to the climate and to the atmosphere when they were burning oil.
This is what happened with tobacco companies. They were denying that tobacco killed, but now everything is printed on the cigarette packs. So there is a certain inertia. You can call it what you will. We can call it neoliberalism, capitalism, the way we live. You can call it what you will, but there are some inertia. People tend to do business with anything. And what best business than to do business with fossil fuels? And this is the biggest business we have, because let's not get it wrong. There's a lot of oil, but there's not so much oil that is easy to extract. A lot of the oil that we are extracting is really very hard to extract. And it is being extracted because governments are giving a lot of subsidies. And this is hypocritical, and this was not mentioned at the last COP meeting. It must be said that governments are subsidizing the extraction of something that is killing us. And of course, this increases inequalities, because people keep talking about human resources, but they keep violating them. Not doing anything against climate change violates many human rights, particularly the right to a clean environment. So we are violating human rights by subsidizing fossil fuels. So there's a lot to say here. Thank you very much, Fernando. Your comments were really very useful and very pithy. So, Anne, I think you're connected, aren't you? We would like to ask you as a first question whether you could explain to us the links between climate change and your area of expertise, which is nutrition. How does climate change affect the nutritional status of people, and how will it affect the nutritional status of people in the future?
Thank you, and apologise for not being there in person this morning. So in terms of the linkages between nutrition and climate change, these are complex and bidirectional. On the one hand, climate change is exacerbating current threats to nutrition and food security, as I'll discuss a bit further. On the other hand, nutrition is affecting climate change through our dietary choices and global agri-systems which shape them. For example, food systems have recently been estimated to cause 1/3 of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, not only from agricultural food production, but also from land use change as forests are cleared and wetlands drained. Food systems also account for approximately 70% of freshwater consumption and a substantial loss of biodiversity. At the same time, undernutrition undermines the health and coping mechanism of vulnerable populations, lessening their resilience and capacity to adapt to climate change. Also, populations most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change are also those most vulnerable to undernutrition. This is women and children from poorer rural backgrounds and households, and those living in fragile and conflict-affected states. Then, in terms of how climate change will impact on undernutrition, this is complex and mediated through multiple pathways. This diagram illustrates a simplified version of the pathways involved. So climate change is resulting in warmer temperatures, changes in rainfall patterns, and more frequent and extreme weather events, which in turn are altering crop yields, causing livestock losses, and therefore increasing food insecurity. Climate shocks also cause fluctuations in food prices, which also affect household food access and availability. Increasing levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide is altering the iron, zinc, and protein content of specific crops, affecting nutritional quality of diets. while changes in rainfall patterns reduce availability of safe, quality water. This can result in women having to travel further to collect water, reducing their time available to care and feed their children appropriately. In terms of the health environment, increasing vector-borne disease, such as malaria, and scarcity of safe water increases ill health and infectious disease. Such effects are compounded by the potential disruption to healthcare services caused by extreme weather events. So overall, these three, food insecurity, reduced care capacity, and poorer health environments, all then in turn increase risk of undernutrition. And then quantifying this impact on undernutrition of climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have predicted that the biggest threat to health from climate change will be through its effect on undernutrition. By 2050, it's estimated that an additional 10 million children will be stunted as compared to a future without climate change. And this is despite progress and economic development. Elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide could push an additional 175 million people into zinc deficiency. And it's been shown that increased heat exposure during pregnancy has been associated with a greater risk of preterm birth and low birth weight deliveries. Climate change is also worsening global inequities in maternal undernutrition, anemia, and micronutrient deficiency. Thank you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias por estos elementos que nos permiten.
Thank you very much for all of this information that has allowed us to see that this concept that we have already been talking about, getting our teeth into, has a huge impact on nutrition and food security. So going back to what we were talking about a minute ago, Andrew, from your position, from the UNHCR, you know very well what needs to be done in order to get some action to happen. In the last few months, we have seen the result of the COP27 held in Egypt, and the results of that summit didn't really result in too much enthusiasm. But if you look at the future and the next COP meeting, which will take place in the UAE,
Lo que podemos prever que
what can we anticipate? What can we expect in terms of key changes or tangible, concrete changes for displaced people and for the communities that host those displaced communities?
The last time I was in Madrid was for the COP25. And if you ask me what has the world done in terms of action since then, I'd say very little, if nothing, probably going backwards. And that was even with COVID. So I've gone to the last COP, I went to the COP before, I'll probably go to the next COP. But what COPs have shown is it is an opportunity to bring people together, but we should not wait or rely on those negotiations for change. Each one of you has to be a change maker. Everyone online needs to look at what they can do to change your own way of living, but also influence the people who represent you. And contribute where you can, ask questions, challenge the way in which people live, and just don't take the decisions that come down from high and say this is where we have to go. Because the way in which we're going is going to lead to climatic catastrophic situations. Going back to the first question, which I avoided, which was the situation with climate change and refugees. Why am I here? Because those people who have been displaced by conflict are generally the most vulnerable. And what we're seeing with climate change, but also environmental destruction, poor governance is those people with the least capacity to influence the future, because they've often been displaced, they're on the margins of society, they've got no real protection mechanisms for them. They're the ones that are seeing the impacts first. And so whether it be in the camps of Ethiopia or in the hills in Bangladesh, these are the populations that we're very much engaged with trying to build up the resilience. To tell you honestly, I'm not that focused on global mitigation because there's so many others doing that, not so successfully, I might add. We have to focus a lot on the adaptation of those people who are on the front lines. Again, in Somalia or in Mozambique or in South Sudan, all locations where I've been recently, we've had people dying. It's be as simple as that. Like people, it's not something that's happening in the future. I was outside Mogadishu, which is not one of the easiest places to get to, again, a few weeks ago, and there was children dying in front of me. And like, how do you explain to them COP27 or COP28? They can't even get to Ethiopia, where there can be support. So you have that human-centric approach has to be at the fore. And so while Sharm el-Sheikh was a challenge, it was successful on a couple of points. We were able to bring refugees and displaced people to that convention, and that was a credit to the Egyptian presidency. So I'll give them that. We had loss and damage discussed, but loss and damage in many aspects was just to keep people like distracted. I'm being very frank here, because there's nothing in it. There was a statement. There's no mechanism. There's no parameters. There's no money. So we have to look at when these statements are being made and question them and say, okay, what does this actually mean? So going up to COP28, push governments, push your representatives, push the UN, and say, okay, what does this actually mean? Like, there's no one who represents loss and damage more than somebody who's been displaced by conflict and is now being impacted by a hostile climate. They've lost their homes. They've lost their livestock. They've lost, I don't want to say their future, but unless we can give them a future other than living in a refugee camp or a squalid urban setting, then we're not really doing very much. So we have to be ambitious. We have to believe in that we can make a difference in the future, because otherwise we'll be sitting in a corner just sort of saying, oh, it's too big. It can't be too big, because people are relying on us. And the fact that you're here or you're listening online means that you're interested. So without necessarily sending me what you're going to do, take it as a responsibility for each and every one of you to try and make a difference going up to COP28. Don't be a silent majority. I'll have to sort of see whether I've got any more time. I've got 1 minute. So I'm sure there's lots of slides here which are very good. But the issue is climate change is having an impact on food security, is having an impact on availability of resources. People are having to move from communities where they've lived for generations. They are moving into areas where there's competition that's leading to increased fragility, conflict, violence and displacement. But at the same time, when there's something like about 33, 34 million refugees, on top of that you've got another 40 million internally displaced. It's not a no-sum issue. When you have millions of people moving, they do have an impact on the environment. So if you can also support us in terms of environmental energy projects, looking at ways in which we can do things better, that does, as I mentioned in my previous response, help us with protection. Because we need to mitigate the impact of those people displaced on countries like Uganda, on countries in the Sahel or in Bangladesh. Because it's these countries with often the least resources who are being the most generous. And they can certainly demonstrate what generosity and humanitarian means to countries and regions like Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Siguiendo con tu perspectiva científica.
Following with your scientific perspective, Fernando, as a scientist, how do you think that you or the scientific community can impact the response we provide? We all understand the evidence, but how can the scientific community impact what is happening so that there is change? Last week I was in Logroño, in La Rioja province, in the north of Spain, and there they're working on a draft law on climate change. And one of the comments that the parliamentarians made when I finished my presentation was, they said that they were struck by my vehemence. And I made a reflection to them, because that was not the first time that somebody had told me that. Sometimes I can be more vehement, other times I am less vehement. My wife advises me on how vehement I should be, but the surprise of seeing a vehement scientist is one of the tools we have. I am not the only vehement person. Of the 100,000 scientists who signed the manifesto, many of them are more vehement than I can be. I'm not sure whether vehemence is or not the way in which scientists should challenge society. And I'm not sure whether scientific rebellions or disobedience or the demonstrations that scientists are staging throughout the world, I'm not sure whether that is the way forward. But what I know is that since the book of Ornella Meadows was published 50 years ago, she spoke about the limits of growth, and 30 years have gone by since the climate summit. So I can't just talk about this for another 30 years, because I feel a little bit of despair. And please do not believe that scientists are angry. We're not angry. We are deeply concerned. And there is a big gap between what we know and what we do. And Andrew mentioned it, and because we're not doing what. Let's talk about the Ukraine, for example. If we had done our homework, the homework that we laid down at the Paris Agreement 8 years ago, Putin wouldn't have dared invade the Ukraine. If we had then started reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, as 180 countries signed this unanimously, and we kept saying, yes, we can, yes, we can. If we hadn't depended on fossil fuels so heavily, then, Putin wouldn't have invaded the Ukraine. Then it backfired on him, but the invasion of the Ukraine taught us many things. For example, and the scientists were quite irritated, but dependence on fossil fuels in 2022, well, should an army have to invade another country so that we realize that 30% of gases come from Russia, 80% of the energy we produce is produced by burning fossil fuels, which are still heating up our atmosphere? We said we had to reduce emissions, and we had taken a solemn oath, but emissions are still going up. The gap between where we should be and where we are keeps growing. So what we should do, tell me what should be done, and I will do it. I remember when I was not a tenured scientist at the Spanish Research Institute, I even organized a striptease session. So please tell me what needs to be done. Because what is more important than something that results in tens of millions of deaths every year? More people are dying from climate change than the people who died from the Second World War. And in the Ukraine, the ships that were taking those cereals along the Black Sea, you will remember that, they couldn't sail because there were mines in the Black Sea. So where did those 10 first ships go that broke that situation, which were loaded with cereals? They didn't go to feed people. 8 of the 10 ships went to feed the animals who feed people. That is business. That is profit, because it's more profitable to produce beef than to feed malnourished people. So okay, we produce cereals, but the priority is to do business and then to feed people. So scientists should be at least a little bit angry, and I don't know how to make it clearer. So we invest so much money in distorting reality that in the end we end up not understanding reality. Thank you very much. Your examples were very clear. I don't think a striptease will be necessary today. Well, thank God, because it's very cold today. Right, okay. Anne, could you please tell us, because in a prospective way, Anne, if we look at the future and the trends that you have mentioned in different contexts, who are going to be the people and the communities that are going to be most heavily impacted by climate change, and what role can be played by civil society so as to mitigate the effects of it?
Thank you. So in terms of who will be most affected by climate change impacts on nutrition, it's women and children, especially girls. They're more vulnerable to undernutrition due to increased nutrition requirements during menstruation, pregnancy, and lactation. On the other hand, gender power dynamics, social structures and norms mean that women are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. For example, the majority of smallholder farmers in the world are women. They are therefore more dependent on land and natural resources for food and livelihoods, and therefore more at risk of climate-related crop failure. Cultural norms often mean that at mealtimes, women and girls eat last and less. And in times of food insecurity, mothers are more likely to cut down on their food intake to protect that of their children. Extreme weather events can disrupt services and support. Women experience additional risks as a result of disrupted health services, especially antenatal, postnatal, and obstetric services. And they may also be disproportionately affected by barriers to accessing services and support. Then in terms of where we'll be most affected, this map is taken from a tool from World Food Programme and the Met Office, using food insecurity as a proxy for undernutrition. The map illustrates the relative vulnerability of countries to food insecurity as a result of climate change by 2050. And as you can see from this map, it's Africa and Asia that will be most affected. The darker the orange colour, the greater predicted vulnerability to food insecurity. The scenario shown here is a moderate one, set a scenario of medium greenhouse gas emissions and low climate adaptation. It's not necessarily the most likely, nor is it the most extreme. And even with the most extreme scenario of high gas emissions and no climate change adaptation, the pattern of countries affected is similar, but the degree of vulnerability is more serious. And as I think has been pointed out already, it's the countries that have been contributed least to climate change that are being most affected by it. And finally, the last part of your question, in terms of what organisations and civil society can do to improve the outlook. There's a whole range of activities and actions that can be undertaken by organisations, civil society and individuals. And this slide is just giving a few examples. For example, civil society can advocate with governments for the inclusion of nutrition and food security into all national climate change processes, plans and programmes, for example, national adaptation programmes and nationally determined contributions. Women are key and should be included, not only as a target group for interventions, but also as actors in decision-making, planning and leadership of climate-smart actions. Evidence from the local level shows that women's inclusion in leadership roles has resulted in improved outcomes in climate-related projects. At the same time, when women are targeted with greater control over resources, it's more likely to result in improved health and nutrition outcomes for themselves and their children. At the next level, organisations can politically and financially support projects and programmes to reduce the food sector carbon footprint. And we can all produce and purchase locally produced, low-input, unprocessed and unpackaged nutritious and diverse diets that optimise biodiversity, conserve natural resources and reduce waste. Ultimately, the goal is to focus on a more holistic system approach to address the huge threat climate change poses to achieving universal, healthy and sustainable diets and well-nourished populations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Anne. Muchas gracias a los tres por eso, ser muy concisos y bueno, aportar.
Thank you very much, Anne, because you've really shed light on many very interesting things. This is a round table, and it would be very important for everybody to participate and exchange ideas. So I will open the floor for questions, and we encourage you to ask all your questions if you have any comments. But please be brief, because there's quite a lot of people in the room, and I would like to listen to as many people as possible. There are mics. There is a roving mic in the room, and then you can also ask your questions online. We've already received a few questions. Yes, there is somebody here who wants to ask something. We're going to listen to a few questions, and then we will give the floor to our speakers so that they can provide their answers. Hello, good morning. Congratulations on this initiative. I think that, well, you've said that we have a problem that is growing exponentially, and we also need exponential responses, not just linear responses. And of course, if you look at it, we have good scientists, good roadmaps, we have money available to be invested in the energy transition, we have good technologies, and we already have a global institution that makes it possible to resolve global problems, such as the UN, with a leader who's a very dynamic person, Antonio Guterres. But although we have a lot of positive things, we're still lacking governance and the empowerment necessary, and this means that there can be a collapse. So we're still very fragile. So if there is a war, or if there is a change in government in a country such as the United States, everything may go to rot. So if you could, I would please like you to cheer me up, because I'm quite a bit depressed, because we have a lot of tools to resolve the problem, but for some reason we are not managing to resolve it. Thank you very much. A couple more questions. Yes, please go ahead. Hello, good morning. 3 months ago, I came back from Peru, from Culiaca region in the Peruvian high plateau, and they were very concerned because they had no rain, they couldn't sow their quinoa, they couldn't eat. So there's been a revolt in that region, which is now extended to the whole country, because they don't have enough food, and they don't receive the supplies they need to make to make the water drinkable. They drink from the same wells that they use for other things. So climate change is also affecting, it is also resulting in revolts and in riots and in wars. So it's not just the nutrition, it is also, a more general thing. And a few years ago, I was speaking to somebody from the European Union, and they told me that they were leaving Peru because they had achieved minimum desirable levels of survival. But in the meantime, people are starving, and they had to choose between taking their children to school or eating what they needed to eat. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. Good morning. I'm Almudena Barrio from Ayuda en Acción. Thank you very much for this opportunity, because, this is a very important topic. Climate change is of the essence, not just climate change, but also the influence of climate change. And next, on Friday, together with IEACH, we're going to have a seminar on this. Andrew was asking how NGOs can do something about this. But within action, of course, innovation is crucial. Being innovative in what we do, right? And different organizations can put together databases for knowledge management so that everybody can gain access to best practices and to key issues for the countries that are going to be suffering the effects of climate change in a particularly devastating way. And there is something Anne mentioned, which is how the gender perspective is important. And if we took that gender perspective into account, our action would be more effective. So, one last comment. Good morning.
I am Antonio, we're for Against Hunger. We have the same goals as everybody else.
Aunque vamos a ver. La reflexión es que claramente somos incapaces.
We are unable to do the things right, I think. And my question is the following. Public health, I think, is behind it's not our major goals, I think, because this is something that we've seen, which is a new approach to health when it comes to finding new solutions and combating successfully this problem. Okay, let's listen to some answers now. But I would like to say something more specifically to Anne. There's an online question. Blanca Mingo asks, or says, the relationship between climate change and nutrition is bidirectional. How can we have an impact on climate change through the things that we eat? What kind of foods should we eat so that we have a less of an impact on climate change? I don't know, Fernando, you could perhaps answer, beginning to answer the questions. Well, there are 4 things I would like to say, specifically about the last question about how we should eat not to have an impact on climate change. Well, there is a piece of work, a report that is very important, and they list 57,000 foods on the basis of their impact on climate change. What is healthy for people is healthy for the planet. Most of the foods that are good for us is good for the environment. I understand that people don't want to start eating vegetables and giving up actually meat, but if we focus on sausages, even sausages, depending on what meat is being used to actually manufacture them, have a different impact. This is explained in this report, and we should read the label, and the label should say what kind of an impact environmentally each food that we eat has. In terms of human rights, I remember very well Ban Ki-moon words when he said that human rights are there after all the huge effort made by the United Nations and all the legal efforts made in order to, and these human rights are there in order to use them and support them, advocate, and being advocates for human rights. It is true that perhaps the United Nations don't have enough muscles in terms of governance and in terms of legally binding resolutions, if you like. But we can act as citizens. Who's going to be the president of the world, so to speak? Us, people. We should focus on 2 or 3 common goals, and human rights is something that we can use in order to focus on our goals. Instead of GDP, we should focus on happiness, which is subjective well-being. And without this legal framework, legal framework, or global governance, we can all vibrate and go towards the same goal, because it's good for us, for all humankind. In terms of Peru, I remember that we were in Peru a number of years ago, and we could actually understand in Arequipa, as well in other places, why climate change is I'll say Peru is the second most affected country by climate change. The reason is because a large part of the country is a desert, and most of the people who live there don't understand why, because they don't have access to those reports. But we understand the reasons, because we know all the scientific evidence. And I remember that when I visited the Colca Valley, that they were actually very happy with the investments made in an unsustainable project for the desert in order to produce avocados for us in a place where there is no water. And they actually were making these infrastructures for watering plants, avocado plants, in a place that is a deserted place. And this was done against, for instance, the European Union legal framework. And this could see, if you can see that in the middle of the desert, you can see a green area, because the water is driven through glacier water. And when the glaciers melt, this actual water is through ducts is sort of directed to the desert in order to water these avocado plantations, and people are making a lot of money out of it. And they wanted to direct Amazon river to water other areas and desertic areas, and this is unsustainable. We cannot take the water from the Amazon River to water those plantations. This is unsustainable. And the first reflection that I would like to make about the other question is especially focusing on businesses. How much money would you say that we are investing both in Spain and in other countries around us for preventing death and disease? For prevention, how much do you think it is spent? Little. We know it's little. When we know it's better prevention than curing. Well, we in Spain invest less than 1%. And this is a representative of the health minister who, with tears in her eyes, actually acknowledged that fact. We don't spend money on prevention. We wait for people to become ill and then we cure them, because that's what gives people money, because of the infrastructure in a hospital provides profit, gives profit. Spending money on medicines is profitable, but prevention does not provide any profit, and this is why we are not investing in the world in prevention. The One Health concept of the United Nations says that we don't understand our health without actually understanding our environment, because most of for instance, 80% of child cancer is provoked through the bad environment. So we should look after our environment, not only because it's part of our human rights, but also because in order to support the One Health concept of WHO. And in this manner, we can increase the percentage of prevention, because health is related to prevention, and prevention and health is related to looking after our natural environment. And that is very important for people and their well-being. Thank you, Fernando. Andrew, perhaps you would like to add something about the questions about the system, the United Nations system and governance. And we were saying in nutrition, in terms of nutrition, maybe Anne, you can say something. Some people online are asking whether we could share some good practices, specific good practices in refugee camps in order to face the threats, climate change threats. And Andrew, you know about the actual impact of humanitarian response in climate change. That's very important too. Sometimes the responses are complicated. Some people say, I'm driving an ambulance. Please don't ask me to have an electrical ambulance because there is a colleague who asks whether there are some good practices databases. And any idea that would like to share with us would be very welcome, referring to the questions asked and the comments we've listened to in the first round. Andrew? And Ant as well.
Okay.
Oh, Andrew, okay.
I think trying to be positive, the fact that we're here, the fact that we've got scientists on the panel, the fact that the technology is out there in order to make a difference, the fact that there's money out there to make a difference, are all positives. What's not happening is it's all not linking up. The money's not linking up with the needs. The science is not being listened to. But is it incrementally moving in the right way? Yes. Is it going fast enough? No. So this is why we all have to be very vehement. We have to be the strongest advocates that we've ever known. If Fernando's strong, I've got to be stronger. And you have to be stronger than me because the science is out there. And so we have to make people listen. So it's not like, so when Fernando was saying that people should challenge him, we have to basically be going out and sort of asking people, why don't you believe? So we have to multiply the science and not leave it to the scientists, but we're all the advocates of the science and evidence. And so one of the greatest things which I've had in my job is that I've been talking to more scientists than analysts than I've ever had the privilege to have before, because they are guiding us in terms of what is going to happen next. And so in Anne's presentation, she had a map of future food insecurity. I've got the same map in terms of future displacement. And it goes back to point number one that I made, we have to be working together. Science, data, analysis, food insecurity, human security, also linked to other things such as education, public health. We're all having to deal with what is going to be the world of the future and how do we mitigate that future vulnerability in order to decrease, I say displacement, but we need to get to those root causes before displacement occurs. The issue of gender is also interesting because if you see any photo ops in terms of, and we're sort of a manel here, but if you see any photo ops of leaders at COP27 or COP28, or even the meeting that I was at last week in Abu Dhabi, it's all men. It's like they still don't get it. Like everyone's talking about the need for having women involved in the decision making, but all the leaders who are often represented at these meetings are still men. And then women is also not enough. You need to have the youth because we're talking about the future generations, but we're not going to be around for those future generations. So we need to be having the children who have got a vested interest. We need to have the indigenous populations who've got the sanctity of the land. So there's lots of avenues to do a better job, but we just need to be taking those on board. in terms of, again, the map which Anne had, and again, why we're so interested, is 70% of the world's refugees come from countries with the least capacity to adapt to climate change. So we already know that. So what are we doing about it? We still act as ambulance chasers. Like we still throw stuff in there when we need to be investing in best practices. So there's also, it's not just the UN, but there's a huge discord within the humanitarian development cycles. So if we try and build a well, then that we often have to go to the development arm of the government. If you want to provide water trucked in, then that's the humanitarian side. It makes no sense. So governments also can become much more efficient and effective if they understand what are the solutions that are required to reduce the vulnerability. So we know we need drought-resistant crops. We know that in the future there's going to be places in the world which are going to be uninhabitable. There's no use investing in those areas if people are not going to be able to survive there. And unfortunately, there's a large number of refugee camps in those areas because refugees get pushed to areas where no one else wishes to live. So we need to make sure that water, even in refugee camps, is not taken as a free item. Water is not free. The environment cannot be considered as free. So water management practices need to be taken into account. We need to be looking at different types of nutrition. Well, we used insects there. That's a valid reason. But also, how do we bring the production cycle closer to the villages? What we found in South Sudan was that there was a lot of the fighting was over cattle. The cattle wasn't necessarily for food, it was over bride prices. So there's also cultural elements that we need to take into account. There was parts of South Sudan which were food secure, but they were not food secure because they'd grow crops, but they couldn't process those crops. Those crops would have to be going to a different market and they couldn't get there because the whole place is flooded. So we've got to be looking at what will these areas be like in the future, but most importantly in terms of best practices, speak to the people and sort of see what is it that they require. Value the environment, make sure that when we invest it is sustainable, make sure that when we invest we do it in a collaborative manner, that we reduce the amount of competition between various actors. And we see, it's just because you've got a mandate doesn't mean that you should be doing it. The person who is best placed to do it should do it. We should be the facilitator and the catalyst and bringing the voices to the fore. So another thing in terms of gender and future insecurity. Often it's the women and elderly and children who get left behind when we talk about displacement. Men often can move to a city, they go to work somewhere else. Or what we're also seeing in places like Somalia is that climate change can decimate the social governance as it exists, and men will join, because they've got no alternative, will join extremist groups. Because one, they can offer money, but two, the government has lost the social contract which they had with them. So we've got to be much more, let's say, sophisticated in our analysis because it's there in front of us. The future of the world, we've got the science, we've got the data, we've got the evidence, but it's creating this community of practice in terms, are we interested in working together to come up with the outcomes that we're after? Or more importantly, the communities they're after. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne, te dejamos completar.
And so what about your experience? Could you share with us some best practices, some databases on those best practices? And then if you could answer, some of the other questions that were asked.
Yes, I would like to refer you to a study I did recently with the Emergency Nutrition Network, and that we conducted a scoping review looking at the linkages between nutrition and climate change and the gaps there. And that gives a good overview in terms of what the barriers are and what the opportunities are in terms of more strengthening the linkages between nutrition and climate change. I would like to echo what's been said already about the need to work together more strongly. We can certainly see that in a country we have the nutrition actors working on scaling up their nutrition action plan, and then you have the climate actors working on their climate framework. And really, we're working on the same things, and there's a real need to integrate frameworks and actions more strongly, both at the national level, but right down to community level too. And then just going back to, in terms of what we can do as individuals in terms of reducing what we eat and choosing what we eat, reducing the impact of the food sector on the carbon footprint. Again, it really comes down to choosing more locally produced foods, those that involve less inputs, less agricultural inputs, those less processed and less packaged foods, so that we're not affecting biodiversity, we're conserving natural resources, and we're reducing waste. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Anne. Y bueno,
Thank you, Anne. I just want to, when I introduced you, I forgot to mention this network you were mentioning, this emergency nutrition network with which you have collaborated in recent times in the performance of a series of studies. And it is a very interesting, I mean, the documents produced are extremely interesting from a technical point of view. It's the Emergency Nutrition Network. So, this brings us to the end of our discussion. I'm sorry we'll not have time for any further questions. I would like to apologize to those of you here and those of you online, because we will not have time for further questions. But there are social media where we can continue this dialogue, so make the most of them. La Caixa, for example, has its own social media where we can continue this debate. I also want to react to something that Andrew mentioned. We also received a very pithy comment from one of the viewers that there's here 3 gentlemen sitting in the podium and no women. Of course, well, there is, of course, we have Anne, but she is with us remotely. But the organization made a huge effort to balance, to have some kind of a gender balance, but they were not 100% successful. We would like to apologize for that. We are fully aware of this shortcoming, but please be assured that we were really aware of this. And I just want to summarize. It's going to be difficult to make a summary because of the many interesting things that were said. But first of all, I want to thank our speakers. And the idea is that we should go from meaning well to action. And this should be a powerful message for anybody to feel empowered. We need to do more and more and, feel that something can always be done. And of course, it's important to do things vehemently, as Fernando was saying. Of course, adjusting our message to the most appropriate channels. We also need to understand that climate change is also related to how people perceive risks, because all disasters are human. And when we speak about saving the planet, we are talking about saving it for the people who live on it. So as humans, we need to understand how the risk should be understood. Sometimes people understand the risk, but they don't accept it. So it's important to accept the risk and, take action on it. And something Andrew and Anne were mentioning is the importance of having an approach focused on people, a people-centric approach. Of course, technologies are very important, but we need to remember that we are working for the sake of displaced people, and this is something that we should understand, and we should understand all the challenges around that. and things should be done from their perspective and not from ours. And it's important to understand the differential impact of climate change. Several examples were given, particularly by Anne. Geographically, we see, for example, that in many cases, climate change makes situations which were already complicated on their own. They're made even worse, especially in some parts of the world. But as we were saying before, the example of Pakistan is the example of a country with certain capacities which historically developed certain economic capacities, and they are, of course, they have challenges, but they're at a certain level, but they're a good example of what climate change can cause, because even countries like Pakistan, as a result of climate change, are overwhelmed by the magnitude of these events. Differential impact is also related to the gender perspective. We are fully aware of this here, but it's important to understand that the impact is not the same across the board. And this needs to be analyzed in different regions, and of course a response needs to be given. Understand the different needs of boys and girls, the different challenges, and help the most vulnerable. All the examples given here were extremely interesting, especially those that were related to the COVID-19 pandemic and negationism. And it's important to also understand the importance of mobilizing people and see what resistances exist. Also, our dependence on Russia for fuel is important. Also, the example mentioned about prioritizing feeding animals rather than feeding people was also very interesting. Of course, there's huge amount of challenges, not just for countries, but also for the United Nations to develop even better practices. So there's a lot of things on the to-do list. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. To the three speakers, to the audience here on site and online, I hope that we can keep working on these issues in the near future. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Jose Maria Gil Robles so that he can officially adjourn the meeting. Well, a stitch in time saves nine, and it's also good to be thankful. I would like to thank La Caixa Foundation for supporting us for over 20 years. I hope that this partnership with them is going to last for another 20 years at least. I want to thank them for hosting us in this wonderful facility, and they have given us also, they have lent this venue also to hold some UNHCR meetings. Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you very much, Andrew. I want to thank the Spanish UNHCR committee for their hard work, and all of you for having squeezed this event into your busy schedules. Those of you online and those of you on site. Your interest in the cause of refugees is the fuel, not a fossil fuel, but is the fuel that keeps us going. As Filippo Grandi was saying at the last COP summit, and it was said here today, the people who are least responsible for the climate crisis are the ones that are most affected by its consequences. So it's very important to make funds available for mitigation to alleviate humanitarian present and future consequences on displaced communities and host communities. Money exists to help refugees and to attack climate change. Sometimes it is too much money, and so that's why it is spent on sometimes outlandish projects, and that is why it is so important to use them for projects that can really have a positive impact on communities. In the Spanish UNHCR committee, we're still going to work with Sophie and her team to protect refugees and forceful displaced populations. For that, we need all of you in this room and those of you who are following us from your homes, because if I have learned something since I started collaborating with the Spanish UNHCR committee, is that, as Antonio Garrigues would say, he's our president of honor, together we can achieve a lot of very good things. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias a los ponentes y esperamos ver.
Thank you very much. We hope to see you very soon.